Okay, so you want to own a maple syrup farm, 40 acres of hardwood on a north slope, steam rolling out the cupola of a sugar house in the last week of March, blue tubing strung between the trunks like veins, snow still on the ground, and the smell of it carrying half a mile down the road, jars on a shelf with your name on the label. It is, by a wide margin, the most beautiful business in American agriculture. And it's real. The trees genuinely do this for free every spring, whether you're there or not. Here's the problem: the trees are the only part of this business you actually control. Most people cost out a sugar bush the same way. Count the tappable trees, multiply by the yield per tap, multiply by the price of a gallon of syrup. And that last number is where the whole calculation quietly falls apart because there is no such thing as the price of a gallon of syrup. There are two prices. They are about $10 apart, and which one you get has almost nothing to do with how good your syrup is. Worse than that, the lower of those two prices, the one that most of the syrup in North America actually trades at, is not set by supply and demand in any way you'd recognize. It's set by an organization you have never heard of, in a country you don't live in, by a vote you don't get to cast. Here is where most people stop thinking. They assume that because they're growing a product on their own land with their own trees, they're setting their own price. In this particular business, that assumption is almost exactly backwards. Here's the reframe: a maple syrup farm is not a business that sells syrup. It's a business that sells barrels into a market whose price is set by a producer's cartel in another country. Yazrep. And the only dollar you actually control is the gap between what a barrel fetches and what a bottle fetches. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why a decision made in Quebec in 2023 mattered more to your income than anything that happened in your own woods, and why every piece of expensive equipment in a modern sugar house exists to push more gallons through that one gap. Let's start with what you're buying, because there are at least four maple businesses and they don't resemble each other. There's the hobbyist with buckets on 20 trees. There's the sideliner running a few hundred taps on gravity tubing. There's the commercial operation at 5,000 taps and up on vacuum with reverse osmosis. And there's the operator who owns almost no land at all and leases tapping rights across other people's woodlots. The structure of the industry tells you which of these is winning. More than 80% of American maple businesses have fewer than 5,000 taps. And together, those 80% produce 19% of the crop. The other 20% produce roughly 80. The trees themselves come with rules. A sugar maple needs to be about 10 inches in diameter at the breast height before it takes a single tap. 16 to 20 inches gets you 2. 22 inches and up gets you 3 on modern 5/16 spouts. Extension guidance puts the commercial threshold at around 50 taps per acre, with 40 and up considered good, and Ohio State is blunt about the bottom end, calling 80 taps per acre solidly viable and anything under 50 marginal at best. So, the land, Vermont farmland, ran about $4,400 an acre in 2025. Maine, about 3,350. New Hampshire, 6,500. The Northeast region as a whole, about 7,300. If you want 3,000 taps at 70 taps to the acre, that's 43 acres. Call it $189,000 in Vermont before a single piece of equipment. Or you don't buy it at all. You lease the tapping rights. Tapping 10-year agreements run 50 cents to a dollar a tap, with published case studies at 75 cents, which puts a landowner's income somewhere between $35 and $70 an acre. 3,000 taps at 75 cents is $2,250 a year, against $189,000 to own. Hold that thought, because it becomes important later. Then the plumbing, tubing materials alone, spouts, laterals, mainline saddles, fittings, run about $4.82 a tap in a dense stand of 120 trees to the acre, rising to $6.89 a tap in a thin stand of 50, because thin stands need more pipe to reach fewer trees. That's materials only. No pump, no releaser, no conductor line, no labor. An evaporator starts around $9,000 for gas or oil, and about $10,400 for a wood-fired rig of any real size. though small 2x4 hobby rigs start under 2,000. A reverse osmosis machine runs from $3,600 for the smallest unit to about 15,000 for a serious one, and a system quoted for a 2,500 tap operation came in around $20,000 before electrical work and fittings. Now here's the cost nobody budgets for, and it's not a piece of equipment. It's a decimal point. There's a legal floor on what counts as maple syrup. The United States standards for grades of maple syrup, effective March 2015, require the finished product to be not less than 66% by weight, 66 bricks, with grade A capped at 68.9. Come in under the line and the product isn't grade A, isn't processing grade, it's classed substandard. So every gallon has to be boiled to a specific density, and the whole industry uses one formula to work out how much sap that takes, the Jones rule of 86. Sap gallons per gallon of syrup equals 86, divided by your sap's sugar percentage. It's in every maple book ever printed. It's been the rule since 1946. It's wrong. Researchers at the University of Vermont's Proctor Maple Research Center published the correction in the Maple Syrup Digest. The constant isn't 86. For syrup finished at 66 bricks, it's 87.1 divided by your sugar content, minus 0.32. For 66.9 bricks, it's 88.2 divided by sugar content, minus 0.32. Run the numbers on 2% sap, and you don't need 43 gallons to make a gallon of syrup. You need 43.78. Read that again. 3/4 of a gallon of extra sap on every single gallon you will ever produce. Forever. And sap doesn't cost you money. Boiling it does. That's an error that lives permanently in your fuel bill, hidden inside a rule of thumb that everybody trusts because it's been repeated for 80 years. Stack it all up. Land or lease, tubing, pump, evaporator, reverse osmosis, sugar house. A 3,000 tap operation on leased woods is realistically somewhere in the $50,000 to $70,000 range in equipment. Buy the land instead, and you've added most of 200,000. Now here's the part that actually explains this business. Two producers, identical in every way. Same 40 acres, same 3,000 taps, same vacuum, same reverse osmosis, same 1,000 gallons of syrup in a good year. The first one sells it in barrels to a packer. The second one bottles it and sells it himself. How much difference does that make? Most people would guess 20 or 30%. The real answer is closer to 40% of gross revenue, and the reason why is the single most important fact about this industry. Let's do the math on what this actually means. In 2025, US bulk maple sold at roughly $2.30 to $2.40 a pound. Maple syrup runs about 11 pounds to the gallon, which puts a barrel gallon at $25.30 to $26.40. Meanwhile, the USDA's all-channel average price for 2025, the blended number across bulk and retail, was $35.60 a gallon, and some states, where producers sell mostly retail, ran far above that. New Hampshire at $50.10 a gallon, Ohio at $45.70, Michigan at $42. So the spread between the barrel and the bottle is somewhere around $9 to $10 a gallon at the average, and much wider than that at the top. On a 1,000-gallon crop, that's roughly $10,000. On the same trees, the same sap, the same season. Now, the question that matters. Why is the barrel price what it is? And the answer is not supply and demand. Quebec harvested 229.5 million pounds of maple syrup in 2026. The entire United States crop that year was 5.88 million gallons, which at 11 pounds a gallon is 64.7 million pounds. Quebec is roughly 3.5 times the whole United States, and Quebec's producers do not sell into an open market. They sell through a supply management body, the Producteurs et Productrices Acéricoles du Québec, operating under a joint plan approved in December 1989 with 84% producer support, covering around 13,300 producers. It sets production quota, it negotiates the bulk price, and it operates a buffer stock called the Global Strategic Maple Syrup Reserve. Here is what that means in practice. In November 2021, after Quebec's harvest fell about 40%, 60 million kilos against normal 100 million, the Federation released 50 million pounds of syrup from the reserve, half of it, By November 2023, the reserve was down under 15 million pounds. Early 2024 reporting put it near 6.9 million pounds against 133 million pounds of capacity. By late 2024, it had been rebuilt back to about 40 million. Now, hold those two facts next to each other. The dominant producing region in the world lost 40% of its crop, and the bulk price American producers received stayed roughly flat. That is not a market clearing. That's a buffer stock doing exactly what a buffer stock is designed to do, absorbing the volatility so the price doesn't move. And it works in the other direction too. The Federation issued 7 million new taps in 2021 and another 7 million in the spring of 2023, 14 million taps. The entire American tap base in 2026 is 16.5 million. Let that land for a moment. One administrative decision in a province you don't live in authorized new production capacity equal to about 85% of the entire United States maple industry. No American producer voted on it. No American producer was consulted about it. And when those taps come online, they land in the same bulk market that sets the price on your barrels. So here's the structural conclusion, and it's the sentence to remember. Your barrel price is decided in Quebec, so the only money you own is the $10 a gallon between the barrel and the bottle. Every expensive thing in a modern sugar house, the vacuum pump, the reverse osmosis machine, the bottling line, exists to push more gallons through that one gap, not to make better syrup, to make more gallons of something whose commodity price you are never going to control. So far, so good. Now let's talk about the grind, because there's a reason the equipment list is so long. Start with the season, which is shorter than almost anyone expects. Maple sap runs on freeze-thaw cycles, below freezing at night, above during the day. That's it. That's the window. In 2011, the US season ran 32 days. In 2012, it ran 24. Your entire business year happens inside a window that the weather can shorten by a quarter without asking you, which is why the equipment matters so much, and why the yield story of the last 20 years has almost nothing to do with trees. Research from Vermont's Proctor Center measured it directly. A tap on gravity tubing yields about 0.17 gallons of syrup. A tap on light vacuum, 1 to 19 inches of mercury, yields 0.22. A tap at over 20 inches yields 0.30. Measured in raw sap, it's even starker. 5 gallons per tap hole on gravity, 32.9 gallons at 25 inches of mercury, roughly 5% more yield per inch of vacuum you pull. Nationally, American yield per tap went from 0.208 gallons in 2002 to 0.342 in 2024, a 64% improvement from trees that are biologically identical. The gain wasn't horticultural, it was plumbing. Then there's fuel, which is the other half of the equipment story. It takes roughly 400,000 BTU to boil 2% sap down to 66 bricks syrup. In practice, that's about 1 quart of dry wood for every 22 gallons of syrup, or under 4 gallons of fuel oil per gallon of syrup. At 3,000 taps making 1,000 gallons, you're burning something like 49 cords of wood, or 4,000 gallons of fuel oil every spring. This is what reverse osmosis is actually for. Push the sap through a membrane and concentrate it from 2% to 4 before it ever hits the pan, and you've halved the boil. 4 to 8 halves it again, 8 to 16 again, 16 to 32 again. An 8-hour boil becomes about 30 minutes. That machine isn't a luxury. It's the difference between the fuel bill being an inconvenience and the fuel bill being the business. Here's a structural fork worth naming: own the woods or lease them. Owning means $189,000 of Vermont land for 3,000 taps and a balance sheet that appreciates. Leasing means $2,250 a year and no land risk at all, but the tubing system you install lasts about 15 years, and lease terms typically run 7 to 10. So the lessee is putting a 15-year asset on ground he controls for 10. Most people think they're choosing between capital and cash flow. They're choosing whose balance sheet the trees sit on when the lease comes up, and there's a cost in the trees themselves that no inspection will ever show you. Every time you drill a tap hole, the tree compartmentalizes it, walls it off with a permanent column of stained, non conductive wood that will never produce sap again. Researchers model that damage as the area of the spout times the tapping depth times a staining multiplier of 50 to 150, with 75 used as the conservative figure. And here's the finding that matters: shortening your drop lines to 20 inches, which people do because it's convenient, pushes the sugar bush below the 90% conductive wood sustainability threshold after just 15 years. That's the lesson hiding in this beat. Every other cost in this business shows up on an invoice. This one is happening inside the wood, invisibly, at a rate set by a decision you made about hose length. And by the time it shows up in your yield numbers, 15 years of it have already happened. And there's a slower version of the same problem sitting underneath the whole industry. A study published in Forest Ecology and Management in 2019, working across 6 sugar maple stands from Virginia to Quebec, modeled sap sugar content dropping 28 to 36% across those sites by the end of the century, with the season arriving roughly a month earlier. Go back and look at the break even I'm about to walk you through, and you'll see why that matters more than it sounds. Sap sugar isn't a nice to have in this business, it's the denominator. It's the number that decides how much sap you have to boil, which decides your fuel bill, which decides the smallest operation that can survive. A long, slow decline in the sugar content of American sap is not a yield problem, it's a break even problem, and it moves in one direction. Now, the failures, and the first one is the strangest story in the history of American agriculture. Between October 2011 and August 2012, roughly 2,700 tons of maple syrup were stolen from the Global Strategic Maple Syrup Reserve Warehouse in St. Louis de Blanford, Quebec. Value: nearly $18 million, against a total reserve value at the time of about $30 million. Investigators conducted more than 300 interviews and executed 40 search warrants. About 450 tons were recovered. 4 men were convicted. The ringleader received 7 years and 10 months. And here's how it was found. A routine inventory auditor climbed a stack of barrels, and the stack wobbled. The drums had been quietly emptied over months and refilled with water. The lesson isn't about crime, it's about what maple syrup actually is when it's sitting in a warehouse. A steel drum of grade A syrup keeps for years, has no serial number, no batch identity you can trace by eye, and a reliable market price set by the same organization that holds it. That's not a food product. That's a bearer instrument sitting on a pallet, and the very opacity that lets a cartel manage a price. Nobody outside knows exactly what's in the building, is the same opacity that lets somebody drain 36,000 barrels one at a time without anybody noticing. The second failure is more ordinary, and it's the one that will actually happen to you. March 2012 came in warm. The US crop finished at 1.91 million gallons, down 32%. Yield per tap fell 33% to 0.195 gallons. Wisconsin was down 68%, Michigan 47, New York 36, Vermont 34. Here's the detail that makes it a structural lesson rather than a weather report. In that same year, the national tap count went up 2% to 9.77 million. Every producer had installed their tubing, hung their spouts, fired their evaporator, and paid for all of it. The capital was fully deployed. It produced a third less than it was built to produce, for reasons that had nothing to do with any decision anyone made. That's the shape of the risk in this business. It isn't that the market might turn against you. The market is managed. It's that your revenue is weather indexed and your costs are not, and the entire year fits in a window that can close in 24 days. Let's do the unit economics out loud, and this business has the strangest break even I've come across. You'd expect the break even for a sugar bush to be measured in acres or in taps. It is measured in taps, but the number of taps depends on something you cannot see, control, or change: the sugar content of your sap. The federal cost of production study on tubing operations puts it plainly. At 3% sugar content, you break even at 900 taps. At 2.5%, 1,500 taps. At 2%, 3,800 taps. 1 percentage point of sap sugar, a property of your particular trees, on your particular hillside that no equipment can alter, roughly quadruples the minimum viable size of your business. 2 neighbors with identical woodlots, identical equipment, and identical work ethic can have viability thresholds 4 times apart. I should flag that those dollar figures come from a study published in 2000 using 1996 and 1997 data. So treat the actual dollars as shape rather than price. But the structural relationship holds because it's arithmetic, not economics. The sugar content sets how much sap you have to boil, and boiling is the cost. On the revenue side, US yield in 2026 was 0.357 gallons per tap at the bulk price of about $25.85 a gallon. That's $9.23 per tap. Gross for the year. At the all channel average of 35.60, it's $12.71. 3,000 taps at bulk is roughly $27,700 of gross revenue. The same 3,000 taps sold retail is closer to 38,000. And what burns while you wait? Everything. The tubing goes up in the fall. The taps go in late winter. The sap runs for somewhere between 24 and 40 days. The syrup gets sold across the following 12 months. You are financing a year of costs against a few weeks of production permanently, and the sugar bush doesn't care whether you had a good year last year. Here's the treadmill. Your tubing system lasts about 15 years. So you are replacing roughly a 15th of your entire plumbing infrastructure every single year just to stand still. Meanwhile, the tap holes are accumulating in the trees at a rate you can't see, and the yield gains that made this business viable, that 64% improvement since 2002, are gains the entire industry captured at the same time, which means they went into the price, not into your margin. And when everybody's yield goes up together, nobody's income does. That's not growth. That's running in place with better equipment. There is a second revenue stream with genuinely better economics, and it's the one I mentioned earlier, tapping tenure. You lease the right to tap somebody else's woodlot for 50 cents to a dollar a tap, and you sell what comes out of it for $9 to $12 a tap. That's a spectacular ratio, and it's why the fastest growing operations in this industry own a fraction of the trees they tap. But the ceiling is structural and it's brutal. You're installing a 15-year tubing system on land you control for 7 to 10 years. Ohio State's own guidance says a lease needs to start at $1 a tap just to compete with what the landowner could otherwise do with the ground, and needs a 7 to 10-year term to be worth anyone's while. So your growth is capped not by demand, not by capital, but by how many neighbors will sign a decade-long agreement letting a stranger drill holes in their trees. That's not a market you can scale into. That's a series of individual conversations at kitchen tables. So let's put the two futures side by side. In the optimistic scenario, you're at 3,000 taps on leased woods, pulling over 20 inches of vacuum with reverse osmosis, and you sell retail. Yield lands between zero point 0.3 and 0.377 gallons a tap. Call it 900 to 1,130 gallons. Sold between the national average of 35.60 and the roughly 51.40 that Vermont retail averages. That's $32,000 to $58,000 gross. Your land cost is $2,250. You burn 40 odd cords of wood. It's a genuinely good small business. In the realistic scenario, nothing dramatic happens. You sell in barrels because bottling and selling 1,000 gallons yourself means a labeling operation, a sales channel, and a lot of Saturdays. So 1,000 odd gallons goes out at 25.85 instead of 35.60, and you're at 26 to 28,000 gross. The stainless tank you ordered from a Canadian manufacturer in 2025 came with a 12% tariff surcharge, and the glass bottles you'd have needed for the retail plan came with tariffs of their own. Your yield lands at the national average rather than the top of the range, because most yields do, and the fuel bill runs a little higher than budgeted, partly because of that 3/4 of a gallon of extra sap per gallon that the Jones rule never told you about. No single one of those is a disaster. Together, they're the difference between a business and a very expensive hobby, compounding quietly, one spring at a time. And the gap between those two futures is about $30,000 a year on 3,000 taps. Same trees, same sap, same season. The entire difference is whether you sold barrels or bottles, which is to say, whether you accepted the price Quebec set or did the work to sell above it. So if you're going to do this, be honest about which business you're actually in, not the growing. The trees handle that, and they've been handling it for a very long time without your help. You never bought a syrup business. You bought 40 acres of plumbing, feeding a price you don't set. in a currency you don't vote on, and everything you will ever really earn lives in the $10 a gallon between the barrel and the bottle.